Space is a vast, boundless environment that presents unique challenges and mysteries for humanity. One of its defining characteristics is microgravity, a state where the effects of gravity are significantly reduced. For astronauts, this condition offers both opportunities and risks, as it profoundly impacts the human body in ways still being studied. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, ISS, live in an environment vastly different from Earth's. While essential conditions like temperature, pressure, and other basic human needs are carefully regulated, certain factors such as microgravity remain unavoidable. In the absence of gravity, astronauts experience weightlessness, which can lead to various health challenges. NASA's research has shown that prolonged exposure to microgravity significantly impacts the body, particularly causing reductions in bone density and strength. Dr. Joan Vernikos is a pioneer in understanding how living in a microgravity environment adversely affects the health of astronauts and the benefits of gravity for those of us on Earth. Living in space in several ways accelerates aging, and thus the experience of astronauts in space may be instructive for thinking about problems of aging, such as sarcopenia and osteoporosis. She is a former director of life sciences at NASA. She pioneered research on how living in a microgravity environment adversely affected the health of astronauts. Her research led her to believe that there were many similarities between the effects of microgravity on the physiology of astronauts living in space and the aging process here on Earth. In 1998, she was instrumental in the return to space of American hero John Glenn at the age of 77. Joan has published a series of books that present simple and effective plans for maintaining good health. Her most recent book, Sitting Kills, Moving Heals, was published in 2011. Dr. Joan Vernikos has published a new book titled Designed to Move. This forthcoming book will show how sedentary lifestyles contribute to poor health and early death, and how movement that challenges gravity can dramatically improve health and longevity. We're here to discuss or figure out how gravity or space might or might not affect the human body. I was very fortunate in my career. I never had to apply for a job. I was invited to do something and it happened. And then one day there was an advertisement for the Life Sciences Division Director. And my husband said, "You will apply, won't you?" And I said, "Why should I? I'm very happy doing what I'm doing human research mostly." And he said, "Well, because no one's going to pay any attention to you if you don't apply." And I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll apply. And that's how it happened. And I ended up in headquarters, which meant that it was the end of my research career, much as folks had tried to stop me before that in various administrative jobs I had, but I never really stopped doing research. I do research on people all the time. I managed the entire life sciences budget, which included everything, bar salaries that came out of another budget. So it was the research budget and the flight budget. And the flight operations that had to do with research on flight platforms, collaborative work. It was very international because I've always collaborated with internationals my entire career. Very collaborative with the science community in the area, which was the primary reason Congress decided to send NASA's research to California, the UN university environment. So having come from that, I emphasized collaboration very closely with NIH. We used to jointly defend budgets for life sciences. We used to have regular meetings. We used to have a NASA NIH advisory committee permanently and life sciences. So I was very active with NSF as well, with other agencies. So the program was exciting. It was applied, and it was fundamental from biology, biomedical, life support to human factors. Unfortunately, before I got there, the astrobiology had been removed. The astrobiology program went to the space sciences instead of life sciences, but we had remote sensing and disease prediction. Lots of applied work is very, very exciting. So it was granted to the science community as well as the in-house NASA research programs. Well, we started obviously with observations. The program was extremely observational. First, with Shepard coming back after just 15 minutes, and on to all the other Mercury and Germany astronauts. And every little bit of information was cumulative in our figuring out that, first of all, gravity was more important than we thought. And we could see right away little bits of information that present this composite of what happens without gravity, or with minimal gravity, with microgravity in space. Right away, the vestibular system became a key feature to focus on, relative dehydration. Because of the reduction in blood volume in response to the shift of blood towards the head and the chest, and the sensing that volume was expanded, and therefore you needed to get rid of the extra, and you did that by dumping water through the urine, muscle wasting first because of dehydration. It was obvious that muscle and bone were atrophied. And then with animal experiments finding that within 6 hours of flight, protein synthesis in muscles stopped. And then again with the Russians, who were wonderful about inviting us to participate in what we called the parts program. And in other words, using whatever parts of animals. They were not interested in what we could do with them. And that became one of most important and rewarding programs, plus the collaboration that we developed over the years with them that lasts to this day. For instance, let me give you bones as an example. Early on, we knew from the Germany 7 flight that calcium balance was changing. So you were dumping more calcium in the urine and it wasn't going into the bone. Presumably it was coming out of the bone. What we could do with the animal with the parts program was the Russians allowed us to inject tetracycline, the antibiotic, in the rat before they flew, and again retrieve the bone after they returned, and literally, as the bone has rings like a bar, like a tree. And the synthesis of bone was inhibited. So it was the first time that we saw the synthesis of the protein in the muscle, the synthesis of bone. So the synthesis was stopped almost immediately when going into microgravity. The breakdown and the loss then produced a net loss over time. But the primary thing that I think is often ignored is that the synthesis, the signal for the synthesis, was gravity-related. And cardiovascular changes, of course, the whole shift of blood, the heart getting smaller, the stroke volume and cardiac output being reduced, because it didn't have to pump blood up to the head nearly as much as one does. Normally sitting or standing on Earth, the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels, gradually disappears, shrinks with time. Joints, muscle, ligaments, tendons, the collagen is lost. It's not exactly a catabolic state, but it's a wasting state, in the sense that is not made. I don't think so. I think we're flagging the same thing over and over again. And first of all, we've never flown an astronaut, a human, without exercise, whether we prescribed it or they voluntarily did it. And even when we prescribed it, as you know very well, astronauts took their own devices, bands or whatever, from the Exogene in the early days to Scott Parazinski devices. The IRAD is useful. It was a device in the right direction. Resistive exercise obviously was going to be better. But we never really sat down and said, well, what is it that gravity does? You're still in gravity. Steve Harley, who was an astronaut, a deputy at Ames, a very sound thinker, said to me something very interesting one day. He said, you know, Joan, I exercised as hard as I possibly could. The minute I stopped, I felt nothing. I said, what do you mean you felt nothing? He said, well, I was not out of breath. My heart rate was right down, and that made me think that we really should map what happens right after exercise. And I had told him then, which is over 20 years ago, and to this day I don't think everyone has looked at the after effect, the after response of exercise. I mean, we know what it is like on Earth, but that's not necessarily what happens in space. In space, you're right back to microgravity the instant you stop. So on Earth, we now know that we are perpetual motion machines. We need gravity stimulation. We need to use gravity not just once a day. We know that exercise once a day does not counteract the effects of sitting, for instance. So why should it work in space? You have to have a way of providing the stimulus intermittently all day. And if presumably when you sleep in space, it's anywhere near like sleeping on Earth, it's not either, but it's closer, then at least 16 hours a day, you have to have the possibility of getting your stimulus intermittently. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes after you stop exercising for many parameters to come back to normal. That doesn't mean that others don't continue. And I naively thought, if you stand up, for instance, every 30 minutes, then that might prevent the effects of lying in bed 24 hours continuously. And sure enough, at least on the cardiovascular system, that was better, just standing up. Yes. Well, my bias is that an artificial gravity device that they can get on and off easily many times a day. And there is no such design that I know is in the works yet. And I insist on being user-friendly. Perhaps even more than one astronaut at the same time can jump on and off. And they don't need half an hour or an hour. They need to get the stimulus. So it can be every 10 minutes. It can be every half hour. It depends. It has to be figured out how often, but if on Earth you have to do it every 20 or 30 minutes to maintain normal health within the presence of gravity, it can alternate with other ways of loading, like the kind of bands and so on that Scott Parazynski took up with him, that kind of resistance, but that only stimulates certain muscles, and we have to appreciate that there's nothing wrong with that. They're big muscles that you want to maintain, but all of the body needs to be stimulated, and especially the inner ear. I never thought I'd live to say this when in the first, because there was such an emphasis on the vestibular system in NASA in the early days, and always has been. But the vestibular system is ending up being far more important than merely balance and coordination. I'm not underrating balance and coordination. I think you want it and you need it, but it is the clearinghouse for blood pressure regulation. It is a clearinghouse for a whole lot of activities for muscle and for bone. Now there's research on bone being mediated through the vestibular system. So when the vestibular system goes silent, literally silent, you're in trouble. And you've got to find some way of stimulating. Now in my wildest dreams, I figured that once we learn what the frequency is required to maintain a viable vestibular system, you might be able to implant some sort of little stimulating device straight to give your cues straight into the vestibular system. But it needs some really systematic research to find out exactly what the body sees on Earth with gravity and what it needs to maintain a functional vestibular system, because you got none up there. I saw one astronaut return from one of his first flights 9 days in space, and he was being tested on posturography on the balance platform, and at some point I saw him beginning to lean forward and then more forward, and more forward, and I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to fall flat on his face. This was 9 days after being in space. He had lost the sensation of falling. The maps that are etched in the brain when you develop as a child to tell you where you are, relative to the environment, disappear. And yes, they come back. I'm convinced my human pod centrifuge attempted that. It's very simple, extremely simple. All the other versions you see now are hugely complicated and aversive to using it. Mine was just a plate flush with the shuttle floor, with just a little mount for the motor in the middle, and you could hop on and off. And the important thing that came from the research is that you didn't need exercise in G. Yes, that was good. But you needed passive G, like in changing posture. So you need to be able to mimic not only the cardiovascular, but also the pull of gravity. Waiting just for a few minutes, 2 minutes, so like standing up out of bed with the bed rest. A form of anabolic resistance may be at work, but you have to appreciate that what happens when you lie down in bed for hours, or you go into space, I presume, is that when you exercise, and it happens very quickly. When you exercise, your natural growth hormone response is absent. We know that with age that also happens. But you can see that with prolonged, well, it's not even prolonged bed rest, even a few days of bed rest, and you exercise and you take a blood sample and there's no growth hormone, or the response is very flat and then progressively gets worse. So it's not only the response of the muscle to the stimulant, but you don't have the stimulant. You don't have the growth factor that promotes the anabolic response. That's just one example. I mean, growth hormone is just one of, as you know, harmony of factors that work in an anabolic way. It's the mechanical aspect of gravity, and the beauty of it is that the glymphatic system was not done by people sitting up and sleeping like we do on airplanes and or standing up in the army or whatever. But the glymphatic system has been identified in someone who is lying down. But you're not lying down in space ever, and all these impediments to detoxification throughout the body result in inflammation. And in my view, it's nothing new, I suppose. The syndrome, if you want to look at it that way, in space is one of massive inflammation, not to mention the stress. And everything we talk about exploration and long duration missions, the first thing we have to do is relook at the environment. There's not inadequate light intensity. The light cycles are altered. The influence of gravity on the head. And sleep is not sleep as we know it. That's just peripheral, not to mention the accumulation of carbon dioxide. Because the system doesn't clear it. The whole life support system has to be looked at again. These are crucial to the design of an exploration mission, before we even begin to think about the consequences. I think it's crucial that the astronauts should go on a ketogenic diet, and you can do it even before you do the research. We know that people don't die from going on ketogenic diets here on Earth. There's no reason that the astronauts should suffer by going on ketogenic diets in space. And there is a good chance that it will protect them. There's a lot of evidence on Earth about the benefits of ketogenic diets and preventing a variety of conditions, including inflammation. And as a precautionary approach, I believe that astronauts should go on a ketogenic diet, especially as part of a long-duration exposure exploration mission. There is some evidence which I have always been interested in with the comparisons with hibernation and hibernating animals. As you know, hibernating animals, bears to be specific, mammals to be specific, don't lose muscle while they're hibernating. They don't lose bone while they're hibernating. The body temperature drops just a little bit. They rely on fat for their energy. They breathe more slowly. And something I learned recently, they even go through pregnancy while they're hibernating, which is fascinating. Sort of preservation system. Yes, definitely. The astronauts, if you ask them, even when the monitoring of electrical activity has been done and recorded and appears to be normal, even when they have taken, as in Skylab, took 4 different sleep medications, including chloral hydrate that went out with the Middle Ages. They had trouble sleeping, and most importantly, they did not feel refreshed when they woke up. And that feeling refreshed when you wake up, I'm sure, involves the glymphatic system, clearing and detoxing the brain. But who knows what else, and it's not just the deprivation. You know, less hours of sleep. It is also the quality of the sleep and the functions of sleep that are not performed in the proper way to provide the best quality of sleep, where they feel refreshed. That is important for their cognitive function. It's not only important to be able to walk on Mars when you get there, because you might be able to recover over time by enhancing the gravity threshold. Gravity that you have on Mars some way. I firmly believe that space has really revealed a whole lot about how gravity affects us here on Earth, how important it is to our well-being, and how we should or could use it to maintain health. We are, as you know, living longer, some of us, but are we healthier? And the answer is no, we're not. The Center for Disease Control tells us 2/3 of the population are classified as unhealthy. And if you look at what the space research is telling us, not just from astronauts in space, but from its ground simulation of lying in bed continuously for 24 hours, you come to the conclusion that the similarities are very real between the effects of space and the effects of lying in bed continuously. And that's why we use it as a model. And what has transpired in the last few years is the realization that the more hours we sit, we are moving less and less. The less we move, the more like astronauts we become. And on the other side, the research now that is gradually being leaked, shall we say, in fact, the changes in bone loss from 1% per year here on Earth to 1 to 10%, 20% a year in space, has been found for bone tenfold or so. It's been said tenfold greater loss in space than it is on Earth. Now from that we can draw a relationship between space bed rest, continuously sitting for hours on end, and aging, which is the ultimate end product of inactivity or lack of using gravity. Gravity, if you take it its fundamentals, is the stimulus for the vestibular system. Now I'm hypothesizing, okay, so indulge me. Gravity is the fundamental stimulus for the vestibular system. If it's the vestibular system that you want to maintain, then you need to provide the kind of stimulus that is most relevant. And what is most relevant in that is the change in posture as a basic signal. And the change in posture movement is the fundamental aspect. Movement all day of low intensity, high frequency throughout the daylight hours. As the world turns, we have night and we have day. And during the night, what do? You lie down. You have backs, minimizing the influence of gravity. When a whole bunch of activities, because sleep is not an inactive part of the day, when a whole lot of cleaning up activities, it's when your cleaners come in and clean out your office and prepare, then stock up and prepare for the next day. So then, as the Earth turns, you have a day, and what do? First you wake up, after you wake up, what do? Stand up. Standing up is the first thing you do. Now you think it's important. It better be. Sitting kills moving heals, and the primary themes of the book, and how the public has reacted to it. The public has reacted. I was shocked when the publisher came up and I thought, oh my goodness, as a scientist, I can't say things like that. Like sitting kills, but he was right, and the title brought attention to the book because it is so shocking. And the other thing that shocked the publisher himself is that it has maintained its interest among the public. In fact, its interest has gradually grown as the realization has come through that there is something in it that we can learn from. I'm very proud of the last chapter in the book that nobody reads because it's the first chapter. I call it Gravity Therapy, because I believe that gravity can be used as therapy. And it's the first time, as far as I know, that anyone has looked at it from that perspective. What are the circumstances, whether it is in people with attention deficit disorder or cerebral palsy, children born with brain damage that cannot sense gravity? Because, well, not that they can't. I don't know if they can sense gravity or not. But I do know that they don't have the opportunity to perceive gravity in the vertical direction, and therefore that the development and their growth is hampered. So that's extremely important, but the other aspect is bringing attention to the fact that the space experience has taught us all about our environment, the importance of gravity to health and activity and growth and development here on Earth. And there's a lot more coming. I think it's been overrated that the Greeks are lucky to live in a place that spontaneously moves. The other thing is, I don't know if you've watched the Greeks speak and how they move their arms. Well, that's all part of using gravity. And the social aspect, the movement aspect, the diet, which is mostly ketogenic with small digressions to the sweet tooth, is conducive to longevity. And you go out in the country and you eat from what you plant, and your animals are free-ranging or grass-fed or whatever, and you don't rely on packaged goods. You get your sunshine and clean air. I like mysteries, and I like mysteries because I feel science is a mystery. And I approach science from the mystery perspective. I think I'm a sleuth that solves a problem, and I try to approach it in a similar way. So I like Sherlock Holmes, I like the Agatha Christie mysteries, good and healthy kind of stuff, not the gore and chase kind of mysteries. But I love to see a scientific paper that shows me a discovery by a process of thinking, questioning, sorting out the bigger picture. But it is a whole, and you have to look at the whole picture and then figure out how your approach can solve the problem.